So for tonight's reading, you're reading about language in chapter 5 in your book, and you'll be starting on page 211, just like it says in your calendar, so make sure you're following along. And we'll be talking about the distribution of languages across the globe. So language is a system of communication through speech. So a speech is a collection of sounds that a group of people understand, and that they understand it to have the same meaning. When we're talking about writing something down, then we're talking about literary tradition. So language is spoken communication, and the literary tradition is the written language. Many countries have at least one official language to be used for official documents and public records, like road signs, money, job applications, immigration applications, tax forms, all of those things. The U.S. does not have an official language, but many states do. Like we talked about in class today a little bit, we have language families. That's the largest branch. It's the big collection of languages. And we know that they're related by looking for a common ancestral language. And we can do that by looking at the parts of the word, so the morphemes or the phonemes, the letters and the sounds and the root words and the prefixes that make up a word. And we can also look at grammar and syntax to kind of piece it together. The same way you look at like DNA and bone structure to piece together how animals are related to each other. And then we have language branches. And language branches are a collection of languages within a family. So it's a smaller classification. So it goes from family as the biggest to branches. The differences between language branches aren't going to be as old, nor are they going to be as significant. So all of the Romance languages have a lot more similarities than all of the Indo-European languages. And then within it, you get language groups, and language groups are even a little bit smaller. So you might be able to break up a language branch into a language group, making it a little bit smaller, and then you just have your language. 2/3 of the world's population speak a language that belongs to the Indo-European or the Sino-Tibetan language family. So these are the two largest language families, and we spent some time making a language tree with the Indo-European family today. About 2 to 6% of the world's population speak a language that fits into one of the 7 other language families. And then the remainder of the world's population speaks a language that belongs to one of 100 small language families. So this is here the Indo-European that we did in class, and then this here is the Sino-Tibetan. So these are the 2 major language families. If you look for the distribution of these, the Indo-European is going to be the predominant language family in Europe, South Asia, North America, and Latin America. And the Sino-Tibetan will be throughout Southeast Asia, and really several languages spoken within the People's Republic of China, such as Mandarin. We look at the diffusion of language families. We want to look at how do these language families move? How did you get one language family spread across all of South Asia and all of Europe? So it's theorized that Germanic, Romance, Balto-Slavic, and Indo-Iranian languages all came from a common ancestor language, the Proto-Indo-European language. And so linguists and anthropologists debate when and where this would have originated and how it diffused. And there's 2 main theories, the nomadic warrior hypothesis and the sedentary farmer hypothesis. So the first one we'll talk about is the Kurgan migration. And the Kurgan migration is the idea that you had a group of migrants from the Indian subcontinent, and they made their way into Central Asia and then migrated across the Eurasian steppe into Central and Western Europe. And they took their language with them. So first you had a bunch of farmers settling here, and then they moved westward. So they moved westward from what is this area right here, and they moved through what is part of they moved from basically Southwest Asia into Europe. And the second hypothesis is the Anatolian herd. And in this hypothesis, we would have had nomadic warriors move into the Indian subcontinent, so South Asia, and then they also would have moved into Europe. And so you would have had warriors that were moving in more than one area from the Anatolian herd. And so one area you start up here, just north of the Caspian Sea, and the other area you start down here between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and then you spread out in that direction. When we look at the variation of individual languages between places, we also need to look at dialects. And so dialects are a regional variation of a language, and it's going to be distinguished by distinctive vocabulary, spelling, and pronunciation. So boundaries of where regional words are used can be mapped, and such a word usage boundary is known as an isoglot. There's a large number of speakers and widespread distribution in the United States means that we have a lot of English dialects within the U.S. And then if you look at people in the UK, people in Australia, people in Canada, then we have even more dialects of the language English. So the 13 original colonies can be grouped into 3 dialect regions in the U.S. The New England, the Southeastern, and the Midlands. And there are terms and phrases that are more commonly used in one dialect region than others. And there's definitely, you probably recognize like different accents from different places. And so one of the easiest is the Southeastern, right, or the Southern accent. So there's a Southern dialect of English. And then within the East, we have some dialects that are specific. They have words that are specific to a dialect. And words that are specific to a dialect usually refer back to things like living in rural areas versus cities, living in differences in food and objects from daily activities. It's harder to find some regionally distinctive words because we have, mass media and globalization of communication. And so there's not as many differences as there once were. But one of the big examples is generic names for soft drinks. And so think about what you would say if you wanted a soda. Would you call it a soda? Because if you're in these areas here, the Northeast, California, so the Southwest, and then parts of the Southern Midwest, you would say soda. This northern parts of the northern Midwest, all the way out to the western part of the United States, they say pop in general. And then people in the southeastern part of the U.S. tend to just call all sodas Cokes, doesn't matter what you're drinking. And then there's some other terms sprinkled throughout the U.S. So these all represent different dialects. So here's some of our big dialects here. We've got the Western dialect, the Southeastern, the Midlands, and the Northern. And within these areas, you have variations. And so a dialect in Chicago might sound a little different than, like a New York City accent. So how do you tell between a language and a dialect? It can be difficult to determine whether 2 languages are distinct or whether they're dialects of the same language. That's because if you have 2 language speakers from regions that are close together, this language might be mutually intelligible, so it'll feel like a dialect. But if you move further and further away from the area where the dialect is spoken, it's possible that you could find another speaker of that language who doesn't understand it. But usually the further apart you are, the harder it is to tell the dialects apart. But in general, if it's a very similar language, it's mutually intelligible, and there's some differences in vocabulary, it'll be considered a dialect. There's difficulties that arise at the boundaries between 2 languages. And so places like Switzerland have multiple languages within the same country. So they have 4 official languages within Switzerland: German, French, Italian, and Romansh, which is the language of Switzerland. And they all get along just fine. Decisions are made on a local level by a voter referendum. So which language will be the language you use in your local government paperwork is decided locally. And most people speak multiple languages within Switzerland. Other places like South Africa has multiple official languages, but there's a bit more tension there. And the tension there can be traced to, ethnic and racial conflicts like the segregation under apartheid. We also have isolated languages, and these isolated languages are not necessarily related to any other language, so there's not going to be attached to another language family. So like the Basque language in Europe is not related to the other Indo-European languages. And so they think it predates the arrival of Indo-European speakers, and it's like the surviving language from when the people either the people would have come in with the Anatolian or the Kurgan migration. The first language of about 666,000 people in the Pyrenees Mountains of northern Spain and southwestern France. And the Basque people in Europe also would like to be treated as their own nation and given sovereignty. So we'll talk about the Basque region a bit more. So that language is a big part of their cultural identity. The Icelandic language is a Germanic language, but it's just really pure. It's changed less than any other language in the Germanic family, and so you can really see what I guess what the Vikings would have been speaking, right? Because it's their Germanic languages. So it's really cool when you look at the Icelandic words. It's like the oldest form, the most untouched form of the Germanic languages. We have 473 languages that are endangered or about to be extinct in the United States or in the world. So, for example, there are 74 extinct languages in the U.S. that were once spoken by Native Americans. So we have languages that go extinct, and that matters because language is a big part of how you communicate, and it's a big part of your cultural identity. And then you get to the debate on whether you should preserve languages. Should we spend the time preserving them? Should we build them, or should we let them go? And it really depends on what the people of that region, how they feel about their cultural identity. And the last thing we'll talk about is the lingua franca. And the lingua franca is the language of international communication. So right now, the lingua franca is the global lingua franca is English. English is also the lingua franca in the United States. It's the language of business and communication. Within a country, you might have something like in East Africa, Swahili is the lingua franca. So if you wanted to communicate through many countries in East Africa, you would learn to speak Swahili. In South Asia, Hindi is the lingua franca. And that's it for language tonight.